I think we'll kick on and get started then. Good morning, my name is Brian Flaherty. I'm from the University of Auckland Library, and it's my pleasure to welcome Samantha Searle here for a presentation. We are in the purple room, so in case you thought you were in a different colour or colourblind, we are in the purple room this morning. Just a brief background around Sam. Sam is the manager of library technology services at Griffith University. She's responsible for 14 library applications and content repositories and works closely with teams across information services to ensure the integrated effectiveness as part of the university's enterprise IT architecture. Sam's had a number of previous jobs. She was here in New Zealand for several years. She's worked in e-research, data management roles, universities in Australia and New Zealand, and as the digital library projects leader at the National Library of New Zealand. Please welcome Sam.
Thanks, Brian. Tēnā koutou katoa. Can I just get a show of hands of who here is most interested in this topic from the library perspective? Okay, and do we have any architects in the room? No. I'm not that surprised because it's actually quite unusual for those two groups of people to get together. So if you do your literature search and do a bit of Googling, there's actually very few case studies of these two professional groups working together in higher education or anywhere else. And along with my colleagues from Griffith, we do think that's a bit of a shame because our experiences of working together in the past year to develop a fairly comprehensive as-is architecture of our library technical ecosystem has been really fruitful. So today I'll be sharing how we embarked on that journey, what activities we undertook, and what the positive impacts of that process have been, particularly for the library. So there are a lot of drivers for the library to embark on this work. I don't really have time to drill into all of these today, so I'm just going to focus on two of the major ones, which were strategic communication and technical complexity. So we're a small team within a much larger and highly converged library and IT division, and so strategic communication with senior stakeholders is both really important for us, but also quite difficult. We seemed to be struggling to get our voices heard in a fairly resource-constrained environment where you kind of need to be able to make your business case, not just in kind of formal project documents, but also have your elevator pitch ready if you bump into the CTO in the flu jab queue, which did actually happen to me last week. So from the outside, the library system space actually looked to a lot of people like a case of if it ain't broke, don't fix it. But that was not actually what was happening with our experience on the ground. Our systems were definitely hindering us in making progress. So a complex ecosystem of over a dozen library applications had kind of developed over time, and those products had been selected through, fairly standard procurement processes based on fitness for purpose for specific library functions, but they hadn't ever really been put together with an overall architectural strategy kind of in mind. And there were very complex data flows between our systems and a range of external providers, which are really critical to delivering the library services, but they weren't actually always really as well documented as you would hope. So, in 2016, we approached the IT architecture and strategy group to see if they could assign an architect to help us. The architects see their role as maximising the uni's investment in IT, and they do that by promoting standards and frameworks that promote consistency and reduce duplication across the whole organisation. But obviously, in order to do that, they have to work with and through the business units that are actually procuring and looking after those systems. So they were pretty happy to consider that request. And from their perspective, the library actually offered an opportunity for the architects to use some of their skill sets and tools that they had in place but were still fairly new at Griffith. So we were really maturing in the enterprise architecture space and trying to move from hiring a lot of external consultants through to building up some internal capability. And this activity was seen as a really good learning opportunity for a junior architect, and it was seen as being a way for her to build her skills in an environment with some friendly librarians before they would send her out into the wilds of the uni to maybe deal with some less nice people. So once we'd determined that the process would have benefits on both sides, we jointly developed a statement of architecture work, and that was signed off at a pretty high level after we had a few conversations about expectations on both sides, including how much time we could reasonably kind of contribute to the process. And in developing that statement of work, we agreed to focus just on getting a handle on our current environment and assessing the applications that we currently had. So that would help us immediately with kind of roadmaps and business cases, but it wasn't committing us to the much bigger amount of work that we would need to do to really start looking at what our ideal future state would be. So what did we actually do? So the first thing we did was actually reviewed the existing information about library systems that was in our enterprise architecture management system, which is called iServer. The architects guided some groups of librarians and workshops through a process where we mapped the information in our systems against their enterprise list of data entities. So in EA speak, a data entity is basically just a grouping of data elements that kind of make sense in a particular business context. So all the information about a person is a data entity to them. All the information about a library collection item is a data entity, and then maybe all the information about a business function like purchasing could be a data entity. Those workshops also looked at which systems we were entering data into, which systems were considered the source of truth, and which systems were actually downstream from those systems of record but were making use of that data. Just going to skip over this next one pretty quickly, but basically the main output of this process was a workbook that showed a whole bunch of relationships, and the worksheet looks about like this. So what we've got down the left-hand side, let me try to, here we go. So down the left-hand side there, you've basically got all the data entities and subtypes, all the information that's stored in our system. What you've got along the left, up the top, is with the blue, is basically all our library systems, and some of those have been broken down into kind of components where there's different business functions going on. So the library management system's been broken down into acquisitions and cataloguing and those kind of modules. What we've got up here is all the external systems, either in the uni or outside the uni, that our systems are interacting with. And every orange line on here is basically a data flow between one system and another system. So the information in this kind of raw form does look a bit scary. It's not really meant to be consumed in this format. It actually feeds into another product that I'll show you a little bit later. So the result of this first step was really that the systems used by the architects now presented a lot more comprehensive and up-to-date view of the library's information. The data entities better reflected our content, the systems were captured in ways that made more sense to us, and a whole range of relationships that we had with third parties like publishers and other libraries, including the National Library of Australia, were in there when they weren't in there before. The second activity we undertook was an application maturity assessment. So this involved quite a large number of staff with different viewpoints on our systems, answering a series of questions in a spreadsheet. So the kinds of things we were asking them about were how often did they use the system, how easy was it to use, how well did it support the business process that they were trying to carry out, what were the response times like, how quickly were changes and enhancements actually implemented in that product, did it comply with industry standards, And overall, how supportable was it, both by us but also potentially by vendors? Oh, sorry. And the outputs of this process were a kind of summary table and a series of graphs that I'm going to spend quite a bit of time walking through. So the summary table presented kind of aggregated scores for each of our applications, as well as kind of recommended technical and management strategies for them. So I guess the interesting things to note here are probably that the scores for how critical our business systems are actually quite a bit higher than the scores for either business fit or technical fit. So that's pretty kind of concerning. And there was actually quite a bit of variation in the strategies that were recommended as a result of doing this activity. So yes, some things really needed to be replaced, but a lot of other things, it looked like the problems maybe weren't technical, and so that actually a review of how we'd implemented the product might actually solve some of those problems. I'm just going to work through the full graphs that come out of this process. So these are the first two. The one on the left has kind of three measures. So business criticality, technical fit, and business fit. And what you're looking at there, the blue is the sort of portfolio overall, a sort of average of all our products. The pink one is the product that we're actually kind of looking at in this case. And so what you can see here is that the product's actually doing pretty well. It's doing better than some of the others kind of in the portfolio. The graph on the right is showing all the measures that come out of that survey that all the staff did. And again, you can basically see that this product's kind of doing above average in almost every measure that we asked people about. The second set of graphs, which are for the same product in our portfolio, this is basically kind of mapping different measures onto a kind of quadrant. And clearly sort of the happy place that you want to be in these is in this kind of green quadrant. And what we've got here, the product is the red square. The portfolio overall is the blue diamond. So this gives you a very quick visual take of, well, where's this product sitting in terms of the application portfolio overall. And so for this product, it's actually doing pretty well. We'll probably just need to look at some optimization. So moving on though, here's another product which is really business critical but not actually doing so well. So very high business criticality, but on technical and business fit actually doing lower than average in terms of the portfolio. And you can see on the right-hand graph, some things are still going okay. It's still standards compliant, the information quality is still pretty good, but in other areas, particularly supportability and the time that it takes changes or enhancements to come through in the product, are way below average for the portfolio. And that's kind of what you'd expect for something that's sort of an end-of-life system like this one is. Moving to the other two graphs for this product, yeah, we're nowhere near the green happy quadrant in this one, and so the recommended strategy that comes out for this one is replacement. The graphs were also really good for highlighting some anomalies. So this product actually scored really quite well overall, but what you can see is that there's kind of this weird mismatch going on here where information quality is obviously a real problem, even though the product's doing super well on some of the other things. So that was perhaps gives us a kind of hint that there's something going on there that we need to look at and maybe talk to the vendors, work out just what's going on in a product that's actually doing quite well, but clearly has one thing that's causing people quite a serious problem. The third activity that we went through has been the production of an application communication diagram, and this is still a piece of work in progress. this is the visual representation of all that information that got collated in that worksheet with all the orange lines on it. I'm not expecting you to be able to read this, obviously, and I did consider bringing the printout as a prop, but I couldn't actually fit it in my suitcase. I think it's really just important to show how complicated the library system space is, and this is actually a simplified view of that information too. So what we've got going on here, the blue boxes are our library applications. So this blue box is one of our fairly big suites of products. So that's been broken down into different components, including the link resolver, the discovery layer, and our e-resource kind of analytics tools. So that's the blue boxes. The grey boxes up here are other enterprise systems that we're interacting with. So these are the HR and identity management systems up there. All these ones down the side here are actually external services. So that's where we've got harvesting by the National Library of Australia and interactions with publishers to support acquisitions and things like that. And again, every line in this diagram is a data flow of some kind. Sometimes it's automated. There are actually examples on there where that data flow is kind of taking place with a person doing a manual process in the middle somewhere too. And the last thing we did was sort of feed this same data into a new tool to do a bit of an interactive visualization. This is really an experiment. I'm not sure that we really know the value of this kind of in the long run, but it was really fun kind of thing to try. So in this one, we've pulled up the data entity usage statistics, and what both this graph and the pop-up box on the side show you is which of our systems have usage statistics and how are they being used. Are they the source of truth, or are they pulling that in from somewhere else? So it just gives you a different visual way to kind of navigate that complexity. So that's what we did. I'm just going to move on to talk a little bit about the impacts. And it's been a really interesting and positive thing for the library to be involved in. And again, I'm not going to go into too much detail, but I did want to share a couple of recent stories. So we got asked a couple of weeks ago by our Solution Architecture Board to seek an exemption from our IT Advisory Board, which is even higher, because we wanted to use the NZIP protocol to support interlibrary loan, and that wasn't on their list of approved standards. And so we're a bit miffed, because why would you need to seek an exemption to use something that's an ISO standard? But I guess following on from these other architecture efforts, we've kind of gone, well, we sort of need to educate those governance groups about the standards that are important in our environment. So rather than just respond to that request of get an exemption for NZIP, because we don't really know what it is, we've actually decided to go back to them with a document that actually covers all of the library-specific data transfer protocols that we're using. So we will take this opportunity to go back to them and say, here's what NZIP is, here's what the Z3950 is, here's what OAI PMH metadata harvesting is, here's what the EDIFACT standard for ordering books is. So seeing that as kind of an opportunity to do a bit of upwards kind of education about the things that are important to us. I also mentioned earlier that we were having some challenges getting our library initiatives prioritised alongside other IT projects. And at the end of last year, we did include some of that information that came out of the maturity assessment in a funding bid to upgrade our library management system and replace our interlibrary loan system. And that bid was successful. Now, it's possible that it would have been successful anyway, but I guess my observation is that the enterprise architects are really, really trusted by a lot of our senior executives. So they're seen as kind of neutral and objective people, and the processes that they use are seen as being fairly systematic and data-driven. And so it's my view that a recommendation from the architects that a library system needs to be replaced is probably a little bit more persuasive than if that just comes from the library. So once you kind of break out of this silo mindset and you start seeing the library's applications in this broader enterprise context, which is where the architects' heads are at, I mean, it really leads you to thinking about new ways that you might want to do things. In larger organisations like universities, there's actually really obvious areas where available enterprise tools offer way better functionality and more standardised ways of doing things than our current crop of library tools do. And integrating with those rather than replicating that functionality starts to look like a sensible thing to be thinking about. So finance systems is the obvious one. A lot of library systems include some kind of module for managing your finances outside of your enterprise's finance systems, which is a little odd. The other one, I guess, that's sort of obvious to me is the business intelligence and analytics capabilities in these tools, which are far behind what's actually available in the industry. And the vendor of one of our major systems even said at the user group meeting last year, he'd come from elsewhere in the IT industry and said he thought libraries were 10 years behind in their business intelligence and analytics capability. So that's kind of a bit depressing. An enterprise perspective also highlights where the same process is being done across multiple systems. So the one that really jumps out for me is OAI PMH metadata harvesting. So, you know, we've got Trove and Research Data in Australia, Digital New Zealand, I guess one of the equivalents over here. So OAI PMH is a common feature of a lot of library systems, and traditionally each system is providing its own feeds off to wherever that metadata is kind of required. So at Griffith, our thesis collection, our data repository, our publications repository, and our research profile system all have OAI PMH harvesting endpoints. And so with an enterprise architecture hat on, you kind of start going, why aren't we just getting all that data into our corporate data hub and having a one OAI PMH service that someone can manage as the service for the uni? I'm not going there right at the moment, but it's an interesting thing to really think about. This exercise really highlighted for me some big issues with the current library systems markup. Don't know if we've got any vendors in the room, I can't see them. But basically the vendors are moving to these larger, more integrated kind of black box sort of solutions. They're trying to do everything for everybody and the results are very mixed. In our environment, the products that scored the highest in those assessments were actually the cheaper, lightweight, cloud-native things that have been designed to do one or two things really well. And so while the market doesn't really support it at the moment, I think that suggests that architectural strategies around more loosely coupled components are really going to be worth thinking about more in future. Brian's going to start hassling me very soon. So, some thoughts about why we think this works so well for us. Griffith has a really highly converged library and IT division, as I mentioned, so a lot of cross-fertilisation happens as a result of that. I think we're aware that if you're in an organisation where the library and IT aren't as naturally cooperative, there might be some more barriers to entry than what we've had. Both of the groups like to work in really systematic and analytical ways, so that was quite easy. Our architect said that the librarians were really open-minded about the process and that this hadn't always been their experience. So I did spend a lot of time communicating with library staff before we did these exercises, what the goals of it were, because it did take quite a lot of time, so it was fairly important that everyone knew what we were trying to get out of it. The word assessment kind of implies a level of judgment, and I think it could be quite easy to feel threatened by people whose job it is to promote these internal standards that you might feel like you're kind of falling short of in some ways. But the process that our architects ran was really non-judgmental. They really made us feel that they weren't there to criticise us. They were there to help us kind of do a self-assessment so that we could improve ourselves. Couple of challenges. Both libraries and enterprise architecture, they're really prone to acronyms and jargon, and you really need to know that everyone actually understands what everyone else in the room is talking about. We did have a little bit of a disconnect about who the users were. The library was really about academic staff and students, and the enterprise architects really saw the users as internal staff users of enterprise systems. So that was kind of interesting. The project did take longer than we hoped, partly because we had competing priorities in both those teams, also because of the complexity that we kind of uncovered. I think we knew it was complicated, but maybe not quite as complicated as it ended up being. My colleagues can't be here today, but just to conclude, I mentioned at the beginning there aren't that many examples of architects and librarians working together. And we really wanted to present this case study to encourage those two groups of people to find out more about each other's work practices, because we share a lot of similar values and similar approaches, and we think it really makes sense to try to work together, not just for the benefit of the library, but for the organisation as a whole. So thank you very much for the chance to share that. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Thanks, Brian.
That was brilliant.